So, is social psychology simply common sense? Is there any reason for you to be taking this class this semester, or could you figure it all out for yourself? This is actually one of the criticisms that social psychology has often faced. One is it's trivial because it documents the obvious. In other words, it's all common sense. And we're going to address that in this section. The second criticism that we're going to talk more in the chapter on persuasion is that social psychology is dangerous because its findings could be used to manipulate people. Well, if that were true, assuming that were true, I think we would probably all be doing things very differently than we actually are. I don't think there's much danger that you're going to come out of this class knowing how to manipulate people. You may learn how to understand people a little better, however. Let's address this first one, okay? It's trivial because it documents the obvious. Cullen Murphy said in 1990, he said, day after day, social scientists go out into the world. Day after day, they discover that people's behavior is pretty much what you would expect. Wow. So in other words, we're not doing much of anything. Let's test this criticism, okay? Let's test it. Is it true? Is it simply obvious? Is this information simply common sense? Or is research actually telling us something that we didn't know? Okay, so I want you to read these, we're going to talk about these following statements, and then I want you to rate them. These are findings, kind of studies looking at soldiers during the Second World War. Okay, I want you to rate the following findings from 0 to 10 in terms of how obvious they are. So the first one, better educated soldiers adjusted less easily than did less educated soldiers because intellectuals were less prepared for battle stress. How obvious is that to you? Not obvious at all, or 10, super obvious? Okay, completely obvious. Of course, that makes perfect sense. Okay, second one, Southern soldiers coped better with the hot climate than Northern soldiers because they were used to the heat. It was a no-brainer, right? Like, why would we even bother studying this? Obviously. Rate it 0 to 10. How obvious was it? And then the third one, Southern African American soldiers preferred Southern to Northern white officers because the Southern officers had more experience interacting with African Americans. How obvious is that? 0 to 10, rate it. Okay, you should have rated all three of them now. Let's talk about them. They're actually all false. If I'd given you the actual results, you probably would have labeled the actual results as obvious too. Better educated soldiers actually adjusted more easily than did less educated soldiers. Northern soldiers actually coped better with the hot climate than Southern soldiers did. And finally, Southern African American soldiers actually preferred Northern white officers because they treated them better. So it's kind of interesting how kind of compare that with how obvious you thought these were and how accurate you were. If you did think they were all obvious, the initial findings, not the accurate ones, this is actually referred to as hindsight bias, okay? This is why we do this. Hindsight bias is the tendency to exaggerate after learning an outcome, our ability to have foreseen how something turned out. It's also known as the I knew it all along phenomenon. So something happens and then you're like, oh, well, I knew that was going to happen. Of course, that makes sense. And this happens all the time in daily life. As Søren Kierkegaard, who was a Danish philosopher and theologian, put it, he said, life is lived forwards, but understood backwards. Sherlock Holmes said, it's easy to be wise after the event. Both of those kind of tap into this idea of hindsight bias. When we're looking back on things, everything looks a whole lot clearer than it did before. Hindsight bias is conducive to arrogance. It's going to make us overestimate our intellectual powers, and we're more likely to blame decision makers for what are, in retrospect, obvious bad choices than to praise them for good choices, which also seem obvious. We blame not only others, but also ourselves for stupid mistakes. We forget that what is obvious to us now was not nearly so obvious to us at the time. So is common sense wrong? Now, common sense is usually right after the fact, but we easily deceive ourselves into thinking that we know and knew more than we do and did, and that's why we need science to help us sift reality from illusion and genuine predictions from easy hindsight.